In January of 1952, deep inside the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington, a group of men sat down with a singular, chilling purpose: to compile a list of human beings who would need to disappear. Not arrested, not exiled, eliminated. The men in that room were not rogue operatives or fringe extremists. They were officers in the Directorate of Plans, the covert action wing of the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, and they were working from an old Guatemalan army list of suspected communists combined with fresh intelligence gathered by their own analysts. The operation they were planning did not yet have presidential authorization. The coup they envisioned had not yet been greenlit by the White House, but the kill list was already being written. This was not a contingency plan tucked away in a filing cabinet. This was a blueprint for violence, drafted months before the formal order to act, and it would become one of the darkest chapters in the history of American covert operations. The target was not a hostile foreign army. It was the democratically elected government of Guatemala, a small Central American nation whose president had committed what Washington considered an unforgivable sin. He had redistributed land to peasants, and in doing so, threatened the profits of one of the most powerful corporations in the world. The men in that room believed they were defending freedom, but the documents they left behind tell a different story. They tell the story of how the CIA built a coup on a foundation of assassination lists, psychological terror, and betrayal, and how that coup would set in motion a nightmare that would consume Guatemala for the next 4 decades. To understand how the CIA came to draw up a kill list in Guatemala, you have to understand the man who became their target. Jacobo Árbenz Guzman was not a firebrand revolutionary. He was not a communist agitator who had seized power through violence. He was a military officer who had participated in the Democratic Revolution of 1944, a movement that had ended decades of brutal dictatorship in Guatemala, and in 1950 he was elected president in a free and fair election. Árbenz was a reformer, a man who believed that Guatemala's path to prosperity lay in modernization, infrastructure, and above all, the redistribution of land from the hands of a tiny wealthy elite to the thousands of desperately poor peasants who worked it. His vision was not radical by the standards of democratic governments around the world. It was, in fact, strikingly similar to land reforms that had been implemented in post-war Japan and parts of Europe with American support. But Guatemala was different. Guatemala had the United Fruit Company. United Fruit was not just a business. It was an empire within an empire, a massive American corporation that owned 550,000 acres of Guatemalan land, 42% of the country's arable territory, and controlled vast stretches of the nation's railroads, ports, and communications infrastructure. For decades, United Fruit had operated in Guatemala as a state within a state, with its own security forces, its own political influence, and the backing of successive Guatemalan dictators who allowed the company to do as it pleased. The company paid minimal taxes, employed workers under brutal conditions, and left vast tracts of land completely idle while peasants starved. When Árbenz came to power, he saw this as the central injustice of his country. He believed that Guatemala could never develop as long as so much of its wealth was locked away in the hands of foreign corporations and domestic oligarchs who refused to use it. So, on June 17, 1952, the Guatemalan Congress passed Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law, a piece of legislation that Árbenz had drafted himself with the help of economists from across Latin America. The law was carefully designed. It did not seize all land. It targeted only uncultivated land on estates larger than 223 acres. It compensated owners with government bonds based on the value that those owners themselves had declared on their tax returns. It redistributed the land to landless peasants through local committees that included representatives from landowners, laborers, and the government. Over the next 2 years, the program distributed more than 600,000 hectares of land to an estimated 100,000 Guatemalan families. It was the most successful land reform in Central American history, and it transformed the lives of tens of thousands of people who had lived in poverty for generations. But it also made Árbenz a mortal enemy of the United States government. In 1953, Árbenz announced that Guatemala would expropriate 234,000 acres of uncultivated land from the United Fruit Company, offering compensation in the amount that United Fruit had itself declared the land was worth for tax purposes, $627,000. United Fruit, which had deliberately undervalued its land to avoid taxes, now claimed the land was worth over $15 million and demanded that the U.S. government intervene. The company launched a lobbying campaign in Washington, painting Árbenz as a communist puppet and Guatemala as a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. The timing could not have been worse. The Cold War was intensifying. Senator Joseph McCarthy was hunting communists in the U.S. government, and the men running American foreign policy had deep personal ties to United Fruit. John Foster Dulles, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, had worked for the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which had represented United Fruit and negotiated land deals in Guatemala on the company's behalf. His brother, Allen Dulles, was the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA, and he too had connections to the firm and its work for United Fruit. To these men, Árbenz was not a reformer. He was a threat to American interests, a communist sympathizer who had to be removed, and they had the tools to do it. The CIA had just completed a successful coup in Iran in 1953, overthrowing Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restoring the Shah to power. The operation had been quick, cheap, and plausibly deniable, and it had given the agency a taste for regime change. Guatemala would be next. The plan to overthrow Árbenz did not begin with Eisenhower. It began a year earlier, in 1952, under President Harry Truman. The spark came from Anastasio Somoza Debayle, the dictator of Nicaragua, who approached Truman with a proposal. "Let's work together to overthrow Árbenz." Somoza had his own reasons for wanting Árbenz gone. The Guatemalan president's land reforms and democratic rhetoric were an implicit rebuke to the dictatorship Somoza ran, and Somoza feared that reformist ideas might spread to Nicaragua. Truman, concerned about communist influence in Latin America, told the CIA to move forward. The agency launched an operation called PB Fortune, a covert program to arm and fund Guatemalan exiles who would invade the country and depose Árbenz. The operation was hasty and poorly planned. Within 5 weeks, word of the plan leaked, and in October 1952, CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith shut it down. But even though PB Fortune was officially terminated, the planning did not stop. And crucially, the assassination component of the plan had already been set in motion. In January 1952, months before PB Fortune was even formally authorized, officers in the CIA's Directorate of Plans began compiling what they called a list of top-flight communists whom a new government would desire to eliminate immediately in the event of a successful anti-communist coup. The list was built from a 1949 Guatemalan Army roster of suspected communists and from intelligence gathered by the CIA's own Directorate of Intelligence. The language was bureaucratic, clinical, almost mundane. But the meaning was unmistakable. These were people to be killed. The planners were not talking about arrests or trials. They were talking about elimination. This was the birth of the kill list, and it would grow. By late November 1952, the CIA received reports that Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan military officer living in exile and the man the agency had chosen to lead the coup, had organized special K groups, assassination squads, whose mission was to kill all leading political and military leaders of the Árbenz government. Castillo Armas had already drawn up his own hit list, complete with the locations of the homes and offices of his targets. He had also prepared a list of 58 Guatemalans he wanted killed, along with 74 others he wanted arrested or exiled. The CIA did not create these lists, but it received them, discussed them, and integrated them into the planning for the next operation. The agency also faced pressure from Rafael Trujillo, the brutal dictator of the Dominican Republic, who was willing to provide support for the coup but demanded a price. the assassination of 4 Dominican exiles who were living in Guatemala. Trujillo was offering trained pistoleros, professional killers, to eliminate targets on the CIA's list. The agency was building a network of violence, a web of conspirators who each had their own reasons for wanting Árbenz gone, and their own lists of people to kill. But here's the question. Did the men in Washington understand what they were unleashing, or did they convince themselves that this was just another move on the Cold War chessboard, a necessary evil in the global struggle against communism? When Dwight Eisenhower became president in January 1953, he inherited the wreckage of PB Fortune and a consensus in Washington that Árbenz had to go. Eisenhower was more willing than Truman to use covert action, and Allen Dulles, now firmly in control of the CIA, had the credibility and the connections to push for a new operation. In August 1953, Eisenhower authorized Operation PBSUCCESS. The mission was explicit: remove covertly and without bloodshed if possible the menace of the communist-controlled government of Guatemala. The budget was $2.7 million, earmarked for psychological warfare, political action, subversion, and the components of a small paramilitary war. Allen Dulles established a temporary CIA station, codenamed Lincoln, to plan and execute the operation. The man put in charge was a senior CIA officer whose name has been redacted from the declassified documents, but whose role was central to everything that followed. The planning was meticulous. The agency recruited Guatemalan exiles, trained them in Honduras and Nicaragua, arranged for weapons and aircraft to be supplied by friendly governments, and began laying the groundwork for a propaganda campaign designed to shatter the morale of the Guatemalan military and convince them that resistance was futile. But the assassination planning did not disappear. It evolved. On March 9, 1954, a weekly PBSUCCESS meeting was held at CIA headquarters in Washington. Attending were officers from the Directorate of Plans and representatives from the State Department. The topic on the table was the elimination of 15 to 20 of Guatemala's top leaders, using Trujillo's trained pistoleros. One officer stated clearly that such elimination was part of the plan and could be done. Another objected not on moral grounds, but on tactical ones, arguing that the timing was not yet right. A third officer expressed the view that knocking off the leaders might make it possible for the army to take over. This was not a debate about whether assassination was wrong. It was a debate about whether it was effective. The moral line had already been crossed in the minds of the men in that room. They were discussing murder as a tool of statecraft, and they were doing it with the calm efficiency of middle managers discussing a budget proposal. By April, the kill list had been refined. The CIA's division chief requested a formal list of names of Árbenz government leaders, members of the Communist Party, and individuals of tactical importance whose removal for psychological, organizational, or other reasons is mandatory for the success of military action. The list was compiled, and on April 7, 1954, the chief took it with him to a meeting with Jacobo Árbenz. The two men discussed the list and tentatively agreed that any assassinations would take place during the actual invasion of Guatemala. There was still no set date for the invasion, but the planning was now operational. The list was no longer theoretical. It was being handed to the man who would carry it out. The final version of the assassination list was known as the A list. It contained 58 names, every one of which has been redacted from the declassified CIA documents. We do not know who was on that list. We do not know if they were government ministers, labor leaders, teachers, or journalists. But we know the list existed, and we know it was meant to be used. Among the training files of Operation PBSUCCESS, the CIA included a 19-page document titled A Study of Assassination. It was declassified in 1997, and it remains one of the most chilling documents ever released from the agency's archives. The manual is a how-to guide in the art of political killing, offering detailed descriptions of the procedures, instruments, and implementation of assassination. It is written in a cold, technical style, as though it were a maintenance manual for a piece of machinery. It discusses the best tools for the job, advising that the simplest local tools are often the most efficient means of assassination. It covers methods ranging from staged accidents to the use of firearms and discusses the psychological profiles of potential assassins, weighing the advantages of using ideologically motivated true believers versus emotionally unstable individuals who could be manipulated. The manual is not theoretical. It is practical, written for operators in the field who might be called upon to kill a target quietly and make it look like something else. The fact that this document was included in the training materials for PBSUCCESS suggests that assassination was not a side consideration, it was part of the curriculum. The manual also reflects a broader truth about the CIA's thinking during this period. The agency was professionalizing covert action, turning it into a discipline with manuals, budgets, and training programs. Assassination was being treated as a legitimate tool of American power, a dark art that could be refined and improved through study and practice. This was not a rogue operation. This was policy. The men who wrote that manual, the men who approved its use, and the men who trained operatives in its methods believed they were serving their country. They believed that in the shadow war against global communism, the rules of civilized society did not apply. They believed that the ends justified the means, but the consequences of that belief would haunt Guatemala for decades. While the kill lists were being drawn up and the assassination manual was being studied, the CIA was also building the other half of Operation PBSUCCESS, the propaganda machine. The agency understood that military force alone would not topple Árbenz. The Guatemalan army was small but professional, and it was loyal to the elected government. If Jacobo Árbenz and his ragtag force of exiles invaded Guatemala, they would be crushed unless something broke the will of the Guatemalan military to fight. That something was psychological warfare, and the CIA was about to wage it on a scale never before attempted in Latin America. The centerpiece of the propaganda campaign was Operation Sherwood, a clandestine radio broadcast operation designed to create terror, confusion, and the illusion of mass uprising. The CIA established a fake radio station called Radio Liberación, which began broadcasting into Guatemala in May 1954. The broadcasts were designed to sound like they were coming from a genuine rebel movement inside the country, a popular liberation army rising up to overthrow the communist government. The scripts were written to mimic the style of Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast, creating a sense of imminent catastrophe and unstoppable momentum. The goal was not to inform. The goal was to manipulate. The broadcasts reported imaginary victories by Jacobo Árbenz forces, invented defections by Guatemalan army officers, and described clashes that had never happened. They named names, threatened individuals, and created a climate of paranoia among government officials and military commanders. The CIA also sent death notice cards to known or suspected communist leaders for 30 consecutive days, a campaign designed to create a sense of impending doom. The psychological pressure was relentless. Even people who were not on any list began to fear they might be. The broadcasts were technically illegal, a violation of international norms against interference in the affairs of sovereign nations. But legality was not a concern for the planners of PBSUCCESS. The radio station was set up on a small island where only a handful of people lived, and the broadcasts were carefully timed to coincide with the invasion. At least 14 recordings were made for the Sherwood program, each one designed to psychologically condition the target audience, convince them that the anti-communists were winning, and encourage underground partisan cells to organize against the government. The CIA poured resources into making the broadcasts sound credible, hiring native Spanish speakers, using authentic Guatemalan accents, and layering in sound effects to create the impression of a country in chaos. It was theater. It was deception. And it worked. On June 16, 1954, Carlos Jacobo Árbenz crossed the border from Honduras into Guatemala with a force of 480 men. It was barely an army. It was more like a heavily armed mob, poorly trained and equipped, and it had no realistic chance of defeating the Guatemalan military in open combat. The CIA knew this. The entire plan depended not on military victory, but on psychological collapse. The invasion force was backed by U.S.-supplied aircraft, a small fleet of planes flown by American pilots that bombed Guatemala City and other targets, creating the illusion of overwhelming force. At the same time, Radio Liberación went into overdrive, broadcasting constant reports of Castillo Árbenz' advance, claiming that thousands of Guatemalans were joining the Liberation Army and announcing that the fall of the government was imminent. The U.S. Navy enforced a blockade of Guatemala's coast, cutting off the possibility of external support. American warplanes flew over Guatemala City, sowing panic among the population and creating the impression that the United States was prepared to intervene directly if necessary. In reality, the invasion was going badly. Castillo Árbenz' forces suffered setbacks almost immediately. They were not gaining ground. They were not inspiring mass defections. The Guatemalan army could have crushed them. But the psychological campaign had done its work. Guatemalan military officers, hearing the radio broadcasts, seeing the planes overhead, and feeling the pressure from Washington, began to waver. They believed the propaganda. They believed that Castillo Árbenz had more support than he actually did, and they believed that the United States would not allow Árbenz to survive. On June 27, 1954, after just 11 days of fighting, Jacobo Árbenz resigned. He went on the radio and delivered a final speech, denouncing the United States and the CIA, and then fled to the Mexican embassy. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, a broken man haunted by the knowledge that his dream of transforming Guatemala had been destroyed not by his own people, but by a foreign power that saw him as a threat to corporate profits. Castillo Árbenz entered Guatemala City on July 7, 1954, and assumed the presidency. The coup was complete. The CIA had won. But what happened to the kill list? According to the CIA's own internal history, none of the assassination plans contemplated by the agency were actually implemented. The psychological warfare campaign had been so effective that the violent option became unnecessary. Árbenz resigned before any of the people on the A-list could be targeted. But the list did not simply disappear. The CIA's final planning documents for PBSUCCESS included a stage called the roll-up of communists and collaborators, a systematic effort to arrest, detain, and neutralize anyone seen as a threat to the new regime. 120 Árbenz loyalists or communists were allowed to leave the country, but many others were not so lucky. Castillo Árbenz took power and immediately began a campaign of repression. Labor unions were banned, land reforms were reversed. Peasants who had received land under Decree 900 were evicted, sometimes violently, and the land was returned to its original owners. Political parties were outlawed. Activists, teachers, and organizers were arrested, and many simply disappeared. The CIA's kill list may not have been used during the coup itself, but the culture of violence it represented took root in Guatemala. On June 30, 1954, just 3 days after Árbenz resigned, the CIA began a comprehensive destruction process of documents related to Operation PBSUCCESS. When an oversight committee of the United States Senate investigated the CIA's assassination programs in 1975 and requested information about the kill list, the CIA stated that it had lost all such records. The agency claimed the documents had been destroyed or misplaced, and it refused to confirm or deny whether assassination plans had ever existed. It was not until 1997, more than 40 years after the coup, that the CIA finally declassified a small portion of its Guatemala files under pressure from Freedom of Information Act lawsuits and its own openness program. Even then, the names on the A-list remained redacted. We still do not know who was on that list. We may never know. But the impact of the coup was undeniable. The overthrow of Árbenz did not bring stability to Guatemala. It brought decades of violence. The military regimes that followed Castillo Árbenz grew more brutal with each passing year. In 1960, a group of young military officers, disillusioned by corruption and repression, launched an armed insurgency against the government, sparking a civil war that would last 36 years. The Guatemalan military, trained and supported by the United States, waged a campaign of terror against anyone suspected of supporting the rebels. Death squads roamed the countryside, killing peasants, union leaders, teachers, and priests. Entire villages were wiped out. The violence was not random. It was systematic. It was organized. It was genocide. Human rights groups documented the deaths and forced disappearances of over 100,000 people between 1960 and 1996. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 200,000. In the year 1982 alone, at the height of the violence, the Guatemalan military killed 18,000 people, an average of more than 100 deaths per day. The overwhelming majority of the victims were civilians. They were indigenous Mayans, subsistence farmers, people who had no connection to the guerrillas but who lived in regions the military wanted to control. The Guatemalan Civil War became one of the bloodiest conflicts in Latin American history, and its roots lay in the coup of 1954. If you've made it this far, I need you to understand something. This is not ancient history. This is the story of how decisions made in secret, by men who believed they were protecting freedom, created a nightmare that consumed an entire country for generations. If that matters to you, if you think these stories need to be told, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment below with your answer to this. Do you think covert operations like this can ever be justified? Or do the consequences always outweigh the gains? I want to hear what you think. The CIA did not hide its success. Within the agency, Operation PBSUCCESS was celebrated as a triumph of covert action, a case study in how a small amount of money, a handful of operatives, and a sophisticated propaganda campaign could topple a government without direct American military intervention. The operation was studied, analyzed, and used as a model for future covert actions around the world. The techniques developed in Guatemala, the use of psychological warfare, the manipulation of local forces, the creation of plausible deniability became standard tools in the CIA's playbook. The success in Guatemala convinced the agency and the White House that regime change was not only possible, but relatively easy, and that belief would shape American foreign policy for decades. It would lead to the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, to covert wars in Laos and Vietnam, to interventions in Chile, Nicaragua, and countless other countries where the United States saw a threat to its interests. PBSUCCESS was the prototype, and Guatemala paid the price for that success. But the operation also had a darker legacy. The kill list, the assassination manual, and the planning documents that were declassified in 1997 revealed a side of the CIA that the American public had never fully understood. These were not the actions of a rogue element within the agency. They were approved at the highest levels, discussed in meetings with State Department officials, and integrated into the formal planning process for a presidentially authorized covert operation. The men who planned PBSUCCESS were not acting on their own. They were acting on orders, and those orders came from the White House. The kill list was not an aberration. It was part of the system. And the existence of that system raised questions that have never been fully answered. How many other kill lists did the CIA compile during the Cold War? How many other operations included assassination as a component of the plan? How many people around the world died not in combat, not in trials, but because their names appeared on a list in a CIA file? The Senate's Church Committee, which investigated the CIA's assassination programs in the 1970s, documented numerous cases where the agency had plotted to kill foreign leaders, from Fidel Castro to Patrice Lumumba. The committee's work was groundbreaking, but it was also limited. Many documents were destroyed, lost, or withheld on national security grounds. The full truth about the CIA's assassination programs may never be known. But Guatemala gives us a glimpse into how those programs worked, how they were justified, and how they were kept secret. The kill list was drawn up in January 1952. The coup happened in June 1954. In between, hundreds of pages of documents were created, meetings were held, and decisions were made. All of it was classified. All of it was hidden from the American people. All of it was done in the name of national security. It is easy from the distance of 7 decades to reduce Operation PBSUCCESS to a set of facts, dates, and declassified memos. But behind every name on that kill list was a person. Behind every decision made in a conference room in Washington was a consequence felt in a village in Guatemala. The peasants who received land under Decree 900 and then had it taken away were real people. The Union leaders who were arrested after Jacobo Árbenz took power were real people. The mothers whose sons disappeared in the violence of the 1980s were real people. The architects of PBSUCCESS believed they were fighting communism. They believed they were defending American interests. They believed they were preventing Guatemala from becoming a Soviet satellite in the Western Hemisphere. But Árbenz was not a Soviet puppet. He was a nationalist who wanted to modernize his country and lift his people out of poverty. His land reform was not a communist plot. It was a policy that dozens of democratic governments around the world had implemented without triggering coups. The threat he posed was not to American security. It was to American corporate profits. The men in Washington saw the world through the lens of the Cold War, a binary struggle between freedom and tyranny, and in that worldview there was no room for nuance, no space for the possibility that a left-leaning government in a small Central American country might not be a threat. The logic of the Cold War demanded action, and the CIA provided the means to act. But the cost of that action was borne not by the men who planned it, not by the corporations whose interests it protected, but by the people of Guatemala, who lived through decades of violence and terror because their president had dared to challenge the established order. This is the human cost of covert action. This is the legacy of the kill list. To this day, no one has been held accountable for the planning of assassinations in Guatemala, the men who compiled the kill list, the officers who discussed using Trujillo's pistoleros, the officials who approved the inclusion of the assassination manual in the training files. All of them went on with their careers, some rising to positions of even greater power within the CIA and the U.S. government. The destruction of documents in 1954 ensured that much of the evidence of what was planned, if not what was carried out, would remain hidden for decades. When the documents were finally declassified in 1997, the names on the A list were still redacted, protecting the identities of both the targets and, implicitly, the planners. The Guatemalan government expressed regret that the names had not been revealed, but the CIA maintained that releasing them would still, more than 40 years later, pose a threat to national security. The logic was circular and self-protecting. The agency had created a system in which its darkest secrets could be kept forever, shielded by classification rules that it controlled. The lack of accountability is not just a historical injustice, it is a systemic problem. When covert actions are planned in secrecy, carried out in secrecy, and then covered up through document destruction and classification, there is no mechanism for democratic oversight. Congress was not told about the kill list until the Church Committee investigation 20 years later. The American people did not learn about the assassination manual until it was declassified in 1997. By then, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the rationale for the coup had evaporated. But the damage was done. Guatemala had suffered through a civil war that killed over 100,000 people, and the United States had played a central role in creating the conditions for that violence. The question is not just what happened in 1954. The question is what systems allowed it to happen, and whether those systems still exist today. Within the CIA, Operation PBSUCCESS remains a landmark case, studied by officers in training programs as an example of successful covert action. The operation demonstrated the power of psychological warfare, the importance of controlling the narrative, and the effectiveness of combining propaganda with limited military force. But it also demonstrated something else, that the CIA could plan and prepare for assassination, integrate it into the operational framework of a presidentially authorized mission, and keep it secret for decades. The existence of the kill list and the assassination manual were not anomalies. They were part of a broader culture within the agency during the Cold War, a culture that accepted assassination as a tool of statecraft and developed the doctrine, the training, and the bureaucratic structures to carry it out. That culture was not unique to Guatemala. It appeared in Iran, in the Congo, in Cuba, in Vietnam, and in dozens of other countries where the United States waged covert wars against governments it deemed hostile. The methods varied, but the logic was the same. American interests justified any means necessary to protect them, and the secrecy of covert action meant that there would be no consequences for failure and no accountability for excess. The CIA's own historians, writing in the 1990s, acknowledged that assassination planning had occurred in Guatemala and that it had been integrated into the formal structure of PBSUCCESS. But they also emphasized that the plans were never carried out and that the psychological warfare campaign had rendered assassination unnecessary. This became the agency's official narrative. Yes, we planned it, but no, we didn't do it, and therefore, no harm was done. But that narrative ignores the broader impact of the coup. The overthrow of Árbenz created the conditions for decades of violence. The reversal of the land reform created resentment and desperation among the peasantry. The empowerment of the military set in motion a cycle of repression and insurgency that Guatemala has never fully escaped. The kill list may not have been used in June 1954, but the violence it represented became a permanent feature of Guatemalan society. The CIA may not have pulled the trigger, but it loaded the gun. The declassification of the Guatemala documents in 1997 was a moment of reckoning for the CIA. It was part of the agency's openness program, an effort to release historical records and rebuild public trust after decades of scandal and controversy. But the documents that were released represented only a fraction of the estimated 100,000 pages in the CIA's archives related to Guatemala. And even the documents that were released were heavily redacted. Names were blacked out, operational details were withheld, entire sections of reports were classified out of existence. What we know about Operation PBSUCCESS comes from the pieces that survived, the fragments that the CIA deemed safe enough to release. But the gaps in the record are as revealing as the documents themselves. The fact that the names on the A-list are still classified tells us that the agency believes, even now, that revealing them would cause harm. The fact that documents were systematically destroyed in 1954 tells us that the planners of the coup understood, even at the time, that what they were doing was controversial enough to require a cover-up. The destruction of records is a recurring theme in the history of CIA covert operations. When the Church Committee investigated the agency's assassination programs in the 1970s, it found that many records had been lost, destroyed, or never created in the first place. The CIA's response was consistent. We don't have those documents, and even if we did, we couldn't release them for national security reasons. This pattern of destruction and denial makes it difficult to hold the agency accountable for its past actions, and it raises troubling questions about what is happening in the present. If the CIA could plan assassinations in Guatemala, integrate them into a formal covert operation, and then destroy the evidence, what other operations have followed the same pattern? What other kill lists have been compiled, discussed, and then erased from the record? The Guatemala documents give us a window into the past, but they also remind us of how much remains hidden. The United States has never formally apologized for its role in the overthrow of Jacobo Árbenz. No American official has ever been prosecuted for planning assassinations in Guatemala. The CIA's own internal reviews have acknowledged that the operation included assassination planning, but they have also emphasized that the plans were not carried out and that therefore no crime was committed. This framing treats assassination as a problem only if it succeeds, ignoring the moral and legal implications of the planning itself. But planning to kill political leaders is not a neutral act. It is a violation of international law, a breach of the norms that govern relations between states, and a betrayal of the democratic principles that the United States claims to uphold. The fact that the plans were not carried out does not erase the fact that they were made. The existence of the kill list, the assassination manual, and the meetings where officers discussed knocking off leaders as casually as they might discuss a budget line item, all of this reveals a moral void at the heart of the covert action system. It reveals a worldview in which human life can be reduced to tactical considerations, in which the ends always justify the means, and in which secrecy protects power from accountability. The people of Guatemala never received justice for what was done to them. The peasants who lost their land, the families who lost their sons and daughters, the communities that were destroyed in the Civil War. None of them were compensated, none of them received apologies, and none of them saw the men responsible brought to trial. The coup of 1954 set in motion a chain of events that culminated in genocide, and the United States played a central role in every stage of that process. The CIA trained Guatemalan military officers, provided intelligence support, and supplied weapons that were used in the massacres of the 1980s. The connection between PBSUCCESS and the violence that followed is direct and undeniable, and yet the moral reckoning has never come. The documents sit in archives, the survivors grow old, and the machinery of covert action continues in other countries under other code names, justified by the same logic that produced the kill list in 1952. Operation PBSUCCESS is not just history. It is a blueprint that has been used again and again. The techniques developed in Guatemala, the combination of propaganda, paramilitary force, and psychological warfare, became the template for American covert operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The coup in Guatemala was followed by similar operations in Iran, in Cuba, in the Congo, in Chile, in Nicaragua, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Some succeeded, some failed. But all of them shared the same underlying assumptions, that the United States has the right to determine which governments are acceptable and which are not, that covert action is a legitimate tool of foreign policy, and that secrecy protects power from accountability. The kill list in Guatemala was not the last kill list, it was one of many. In the decades since PBSUCCESS, the United States has compiled target lists in Vietnam, in Laos, in El Salvador, in Colombia, and in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The language has changed. We no longer call them kill lists. We call them high-value target lists or disposition matrices. But the logic is the same. Certain individuals are identified as threats, and they are eliminated, often without trial, without due process, and without public debate. The technology has improved. Drones have replaced pistoleros. Algorithms have replaced index cards. But the moral questions remain. The Guatemala documents force us to confront those questions. They force us to ask whether a democracy can engage in covert assassination and still call itself a democracy. They force us to ask whether the secrecy that protects national security also protects abuses of power. They force us to ask whether the men who compiled the kill list in January 1952 were patriots or war criminals, and whether that distinction even matters if the consequences are the same. These are not comfortable questions. They do not have easy answers. But they are the questions that the history of Operation PBSUCCESS demands we ask. Because if we do not ask them, if we allow the past to remain buried in classified archives and redacted documents, then we risk repeating the same mistakes, in the same way, with the same terrible consequences. The legacy of the Guatemala coup is written in the mass graves of the Guatemalan highlands, in the scars of a civil war that lasted longer than most of the people reading this have been alive, and in the knowledge that it did not have to happen. Jacobo Árbenz could have been allowed to finish his term. The land reform could have been allowed to succeed. The people of Guatemala could have been allowed to choose their own future. But that would have required the United States to accept a government that challenged American corporate interests. And in the Cold War calculus of 1954, that was unacceptable. So the CIA drew up a kill list, trained assassins, and launched a propaganda campaign that destroyed a democracy and set in motion decades of violence. The men who planned it believed they were defending freedom, but the price of that belief was paid by the people of Guatemala. And that is the true legacy of Operation PBSUCCESS. Not the tactical success celebrated in CIA training manuals, but the human cost that followed, the cost that is still being paid, the cost that can never be fully calculated or repaid.